Now to a discussion of some of those broader issues of race, religion, and politics that have been in the air since last week. Jeffrey Brown has that conversation.
And we take a look at some of the issues raised now with Bishop Harry Jackson, Jr., Senior Pastor of Hope Christian Church in Maryland. He's founder and chairman of the Conservative High Impact Leadership Coalition and co-author of the book Personal Faith, Public Policy. The Very Reverend Tracey Lind of Trinity Episcopal Cathedral in Cleveland. Melissa Harris-Lacewell, professor of politics and African American studies at Princeton University, and author of the book Barbershops, Bibles, and BET, Everyday Thought and Black Political Thought. And Michael Cromartie, vice president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, a Washington-based think tank. Well, Dean Lind, I want to start with you and start with what we just heard about public attitudes a week after all the talk about Reverend Wright and Barack Obama's response. Does it jibe, what you just heard, does it jibe with what you've experienced in your church in the last week?
I think it absolutely jives. My congregation was a downtown, diverse congregation with Republicans, Democrats, and independents. We're very impressed with what Barack Obama had to say in his speech. They really appreciated his honesty and his forthrightness, his speaking truth in love, and his coming true about his own story and talking about one of the most important issues in this country. Bishop, as far as their feeling,
go ahead.
As far as their feelings about Reverend Wright, I think my congregation, while we wouldn't necessarily agree with everything he says and how he says it, has a deep and abiding appreciation for the black church preaching tradition.
Bishop Jackson, what about in your church? What is the sense of, do you sense more understanding, more confusion, more anger about these things? Or what?
No, I think many people believe that this is a problem that finally needs to be talked about, but we feel like the appropriate place to talk about it is within the church. Ironically, the statements from a pulpit have affected the nation, and although we appreciate Barack Obama's speech, it can't be solved by politics. I believe it's a heart issue, a sin issue, a moral issue.
And Reverend Wright's speech or sermons?
Well, I think his sermons are incendiary, and they represent an old school approach to a common problem. I think we need a new civil rights movement. There's a growing dimension of integration that's happening in the church today. Churches like mine, I pastor a church with 22 different nationalities in it, blacks, whites, Hispanics, predominantly African American. And I believe that there needs to be an aggressive decision by Bible-believing churches to end racism and to end desegregation, or I should say desegregate, the churches in America, like I said, right?
Melissa Harris-Lacewell, what's your answer to where we are a week later in terms of more confusion, more anger, more understanding? What?
Well, I'd have to say that what I find most confusing is that I actually agree a great deal with what Bishop Jackson just said, and I'm on the opposite side from him. So in this way, I see it as being very good. I agree with Bishop Jackson that although the gauntlet was laid down in this case by a political leader, by a candidate for the U.S. presidency, that the conversation about race and racial healing has really got to occur in civil society. And given that this emerged as a result of a flap about churches, why not start with religious institutions? How exciting would it be if right now today churches that are predominantly African American would make a phone call to the church across town that's predominantly white? If the Jewish synagogue would make a call to the Baptist church and say, well, maybe we're not going to worship together, but how about we get together on Saturday afternoon and build a house with Habitat for Humanity together? What if we find some common ground on which we could have vocabulary in which we could talk to each other, find some common agreements? I agree with the bishop that there has been some movement towards interracial worship, but overall we remain an incredibly divided racially and spiritually nation, and so it's time for spiritual leaders to start talking about how to close that divide.
Okay, and Michael Cromartie, your reaction a week later, where are we?
Well, I think it's very important that we're having this conversation, and it's very important that Senator Obama made that speech. The problem, however, with having a civil conversation about this is that Reverend Wright is in the background. Reverend Wright is a man who is very much a political extremist. He's friends with Louis Farrakhan. He brags about that. He believes deeply in wacky conspiracy theories. And so it's going to be difficult to have a conversation about race and injustice in America when you have in the background someone like Reverend Wright, who Senator Obama sat under for 20 years and has given a significant amount of money to. I think that's going to hurt the conversation.
Does it play into the public attitudes? We were just listening to Andy Cohat's numbers. Do you sense it coming out in those polls or not yet? Attitudes about Reverend Wright, I mean.
Andy Cohat said that it's going to be a potential problem for Senator Obama. I think it's going to be more than a potential problem for Senator Obama. This issue is not going to go away. You hear more and more about it, and especially in light of the more things that we're learning about Reverend Wright's comments about various ethnic groups, about conspiracy theories, about the U.S. government. He accuses the U.S. government of have started the AIDS crisis in America. I mean, these conspiracy theories would not be tolerated if the candidate we're talking about was, say, President Bush in the year 2000. If we found out that President Bush was in a church like that for 20 years, I think the conversation would not end, and it's not going to end on this one.
Dee Lind, respond to that. You come from a progressive ministry tradition. Is there a context in which we should think about Reverend Wright and his language and rhetoric?
Yeah, I think we need to consider Reverend Wright in the context of the historic black preaching tradition and in the historic tradition of the prophets. The biblical prophets, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, used harsh language. And furthermore, I don't think we can suggest that a presidential candidate or any other person agrees with everything that their minister says. Moreover, I think we've got to be careful about taking Reverend Wright's comments out of context.
Bishop Jackson?
Well, I don't like his comments. In our book, Personal Faith, Public Policy, we talk about one of the issues we can solve as a people of faith. The language that Reverend Wright uses will not bring people together. This is a unique opportunity we have to heal the racial divide. So I don't want to let us off the hook.
But let me ask you, to help people understand, is that liberation theology tradition, black liberation theology, is that part of a mainstream tradition? How should we think about it?
Well, there's a debate over that. The liberation theology actually originated in 1967 by a Roman Catholic priest, but I think it ties into more of a black nationalistic kind of spirit that has been prevalent in the black community for years. And I believe that there needs to be this healing tone. I honor the fact that Reverend Wright has done great work in his community, but what I don't believe that in this particular generation that we need to dig up old wounds, and I think there needs to be some healing that goes on behind closed doors. The church needs to talk with itself, and the sin, if you will, in this situation is not Barack Obama's, and in fact it's not even Jeremiah Wright's. The greater sin is that the church has not addressed this problem, and the American church has let this thing fester for far too many years. We need to heal ourselves.
Professor Harris-Lacewell, what would you add to that?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I think it's quite important that we not try to write off Jeremiah Wright by saying he's wacky and out of sorts and completely nuts. I think that's not going to get us at all close to having this conversation. Part of what Obama's speech did, and I can say as someone who attended Jeremiah Wright's church for 7 years during the years that I lived in Chicago, is that many people, not only in Jeremiah Wright's church, but many African Americans agree with at least some part of what Jeremiah Wright is talking about when he's talking about his particular anger and anxiety about the U.S. state in relationship to black Americans. Part of that is the question of the HIV/AIDS crisis. Part of that has to do with continuing poverty and racial inequality. And I think if we're going to get to a place where we can have a conversation that has to do with healing, one of the things we have to do is to take seriously one another's perspectives, even if they seem quite different from our own.
There was